Today, you are going to learn everything you need to know regarding route handlers within Next.js. We're first going to cover some examples from the docs on how they work and kind of go over some conceptual overviews, but then we're going to dive into VS Code and get into our own personalized example of how they work. And also make sure to say hi in the comments below to my dog Ragnar, looking at me in the background, probably waiting for his dad to take him on a walk here. But first off, route handlers in Next.js. So basically they allow you to create custom request handlers for a given route using the web request and response APIs. And the way that these work is that route handlers are defined in a route.js or TS file inside your app directory. Okay, so here in this example here, within your app directory, if you also had an API directory, now these do not need to be in an API directory within the new Next.js app router. They do not need to be in the API directory, but if they were, and you created a route.js file within your API directory, then that is automatically going to create a API endpoint that you can make a request to and handle requests from, in which you can access that endpoint, and it's going to be at whatever your URL for your website is, /API, and then that is going to be your endpoint there. Now, if you also had API / and then you had another directory called posts, and then you had a route.js file within that post directory, then you could access that endpoint at whatever your website URL is, /API /posts. And that is going to be the endpoint there. So this is basically effectively allowing you to create your own custom API endpoints for your website. So in this example, they say route handlers can be nested inside the app directory, similar to page.js and layout.js files. But one important thing to remember is that there cannot be a route.js file within the same route segment level as a page.js file. So what this means is that in this kind of example path right here, if we also had a page.js file within this API directory, then this would not be valid. We could not also have a route.js file within that. Okay. So if you had an example directory called posts and you had a page.js file within your post directory, well, you couldn't also have a route.js file within your post directory because you cannot have a route.js file and a post.js file in the same level of a route segment. Okay. That is going to be invalid and is going to cause an error. Now, the supported HTTP methods here are going to be all of your kind of standard HTTP methods: get, post, put, patch, delete, and head, and options. And if you use an unsupported method, Next.js returns a 405 method not found. Now, Next.js also extends the request and response APIs with their own next request and next response APIs to provide convenient helpers for kind of more advanced use cases. So you can use next request and next response to handle these requests and response. All right, and we'll get into an example of how this works in just a sec. And a couple of important things to note here regarding the behavior of these route handlers are that route handlers are statically evaluated by default when using the get method with the response object. So here in this example, if you use a get function, so maybe to back up a little bit here. So within your route.js file, to create a function that handles like a get request or a post request or a put request, you want to handle one of those HTTP methods. What you would do is within your route.js file, you would export a function that would be titled either all capital get, all capital post, all capital put, so on and so forth. So in this example here of app /items /route.js, what this would handle here is you would export an async function get, and that would handle a get request that you would make to whatever the URL of your website is /items. And this would handle a get request. Now, if you wanted to handle a post request to that URL endpoint, then you would, in this same file here, you could export an async function called post, and that would handle a post request to whatever your URL is for your website /items and making a post request to that endpoint. Okay. So you can just export whatever function you want to for the HTTP method that you want to handle here. So in this instance, it's handling a GET request to the items endpoint. And then, as I was saying, this is going to be statically evaluated because they're just using a GET function here. They're not using the request object at all here. They're just using a next response to return some data here. So in this, it's going to be statically evaluated. And what this means is that for statically evaluated stuff, this is going to be for static data. So it doesn't change often. So for example, a blog post. And dynamic data is data that does change often. For example, a shopping cart list. It's something that is going to be specific to the users. So for static data, Next.js is going to use static fetches. This means the data will be fetched at build time, cached, and reused on each request. This will improve the speed of your application here because it's just cached and it's already requested, and it's going to be much more quick in this example. And this is kind of what it says here for the two benefits of this static data. But for dynamic data, and it's personalized to the user, then these fetch requests are going to be made on each request without caching them. Okay. So in our route handlers, if we just create a standard GET method here, and we don't use like the request within the parentheses here or within our function, it's going to just statically evaluate this. Now for dynamic route handlers, they're going to be automatically dynamic when you use the request object within the GET method. So if you use GET and then request here, that's going to automatically be dynamic here. And then if you're using any other HTTP method, so post, put, patch, delete, all those are going to be dynamic automatically. And then if you're using dynamic functions like cookies and headers, I'll show you an example of those in a second. And then the segment config options manually specifies dynamic mode. So you can also manually specify that you want something to be dynamic. Okay, so here, this is an example of, so I still have my app/items/route.js. So this is creating an endpoint at whatever your URL is, /items. It's creating a route here, and it's handling a post request to that endpoint. Okay, so if you posted to your URL name /items, then this function would handle this post request. And they're just exporting an async function post. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense seeing this as what I explained kind of earlier on how this kind of works. And with the post request, it's going to be automatically dynamically evaluated. And they say, good to know, previously API routes could have been used for use cases like handling form submissions, but route handlers are likely not the solution for this anymore. And they will be recommending using mutations when that is fully ready to go. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. And then here they talk about revalidating static data. So let's say you have a static method or a route handler that's going to be evaluated statically. So you're just using a GET request and you're not using any headers or anything that would make this dynamic. Well, you could still make sure to revalidate that data instead of only using the cache data at build time. And the way that you can do that is within your fetch request, you can pass within your options a property called next. And that's going to be an object in which you can set a property called revalidate, and you can set it to a number. So if you set it to 60, that's going to be revalidated every 60 seconds. Now you could also export a constant called revalidate and set that to a number. And you could do that as like a config option. Okay, so this is how you could add some revalidation to your static functions or your static route handlers. And then here they give a couple examples of how you can use cookies. So you can import cookies, a function cookies, from next/headers. And this is how you could access your cookies within your route handlers. So you could say const cookie store is equal to calling your cookies function. And that is how you could kind of get some different tokens or something like that from your cookies. And you could do a very similar thing with your headers, in which you can import headers from next headers, and then you could call that headers function to get access to your headers from your different API requests as well. Okay, so that is how you could use cookies and headers within your route handlers. And then of course, you can also use the web APIs directly and use the request.headers and create a new headers object. And you could do the same thing with cookies here as well. You could use the web APIs directly as well. To perform redirects, you can import redirect from Next navigation, and then you can call that redirect function. So that's pretty straightforward. And then for dynamic route segments, which we will do an example of this when I spin up VS Code here in a second, but you can effectively access the params object as a second argument to your GET request. So if I have an API endpoint that is /items / slug, so a dynamic route segment, and I make a request to this endpoint, then automatically you're going to get access to, this is technically, I think they call it a context object. And in this object, it's going to have a params property in which you're going to be able to get your kind of slug data here. And then you can make a request to go get that slug from your database. So this is how you can handle dynamic segments. This will make a lot more sense when we kind of dive into an example later. But just know that when using dynamic segments here, you get a second argument to your GET functions that gives you access to whatever this kind of dynamic value is, allowing you to better handle this route segment. So if you went to items /a, then on your params property of the second argument to your GET request, you're going to be able to access that /a value by accessing params.slug. That would be A if you went to /a. If you went to /b, then your slug is going to have the value of B. And if you went to /c, your slug is going to have the value of C, because it's going to be dynamically evaluated there. And you can access that on the params property of the second argument passed to your GET request handler there. I know that was probably a lot, but it'll make more sense when we kind of dive into things. And then we're not going to dive into this too much, but they also give you the option to implement streaming within your route handlers. And this could be used for like large language models and different stuff with AI these days. So that also is an option for you. If you're implementing that, that's probably a little bit more advanced. So you could come to the docs here and consult those on how to implement streaming. And then you can also access the request body just like you kind of normally would with the standard web API methods. You can access that. So you can say res equals await request.json and then access that request body there. And they also give you some helpers with form data. So you can do request.form data and access certain form data if you are accessing form data there. And then you can also access the CORS headers and set the CORS headers on a response using standard web API methods. So here you can do a new response, and as a second argument to your response function, you can pass in a object in which it has a headers property, and that's where you could set your CORS. And, CORS is historically a very tricky thing to work on. If you have experience with web development, you probably run into some tricky CORS issues. So I'm definitely with you on that. And then they give also some advice on Edge and Node runtimes. I'm not going to get into that too much as a lot of that is still in alpha and stuff like that. So I think that covers kind of a conceptual overview on how route handlers work pretty well here. But now let's actually dive into VS Code and show you an example of how this works. So where we're going to start is I'm just going to create a new Next app here. So I'm going to do npx create Next app at latest. I'm going to run that, and I'm going to just name it route handlers here. And then I'm not going to use TypeScript here. I'm not going to use ESLint or Tailwind. I'm not going to use an src directory. I am going to use the app router, and I'm not going to customize the default import alias. So this is going to run here. And now I'm just going to do file open. I'm going to open this project, and that's going to open my new project in VS Code. So I have my new project here. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to use this JSON placeholder API here. And I'm going to just basically treat this like our database here. Instead of like spinning up an actual database and like, maybe using Prisma or something like that, which we might do in future videos. I don't want this tutorial to be on like how databases work. I just want it to be something easy to teach you how to create route handlers. So that's why we're going to just go this API route, and we're going to use this JSON placeholder API, and we're going to kind of use this within our route handlers to kind of show you how it might work. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a posts page in which we're going to call this API endpoint here, and we're going to create our own route handler for this. And then we're going to display those posts. And then what I also think we'll do is we will create a just singular post page in which we create a dynamic route handler. And when we go to post/1, then we will handle that within our dynamic route handler, and we will show just a single post. And then I think we'll also make a route handler to handle a post request. And I think that we can also do that with this API. We could also update one with a put request. We might do that as well. We could also do a patch or a delete, but we'll show you one of these here as we go. Okay, so here's creating a resource. So we could let's just do a post request here. So that is kind of the game plan going into this. So back to the code editor here. What we first want to do is we want to create a new page for our posts. So within my app directory, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to just call this posts. And then I'm going to create a page.jsx file, and I'm going to export default function posts. I'm going to return, for now, just do an H1 that says posts. Okay. And I'm going to run npm run dev, and it's going to start my server on localhost 3000. And then I'm going to go to localhost 3000 here. And you can see I have just my blank template here as my homepage. And if I go to posts, you see my beautiful post page. So if I go back to VS Code, now what I'm going to want to do is for my post page, I'm going to want to make a GET request to that post endpoint, get all of my posts, map over those, and then show a singular post for every post. So to do this, let's first create our post component. And then once we create our post component, then we'll create our API route handler and get that data. But let's first create a post component. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this components. And I'm going to just call this post.jsx. And I'm going to export a default function called post. And this is going to be passed. So if I go back to my API here, each post is going to have a title, a body, and an ID. So I'm going to destructure as props a title, not a total, but a title, a body, as well as I think I'm going to use an ID because when we eventually make our dynamic routes and stuff like that, I think I'm going to need to use that ID. So I'm going to do this, and then we're just going to return a very basic component. So I'm going to just return a div, and then let's do like an H3, and we will pass the title into that H3. Let's do a p tag, and then we'll render out our body here. And then I think I'm going to want to use a button that navigates to the /ID for a dynamic route here. And to do this, I don't necessarily want to make this entire post a client component because we're going to have to perform client-side navigation here because we're going to have to push our user to / whatever that dynamic ID is. So I could do something like, use client here, but that would make this entire function a client component, but it doesn't really need to be. The only thing that needs to be interactive for this function is going to be my posts button. So I'm going to actually back it up here, and I'm going to create another component. And this is just going to be post nav button, I guess. and you could come up with better names. And I'm going to make this a client component, and I'm going to export a default function post nav button. And I think that I'm going to want to pass an ID to this button. And all this is going to do is going to return a button in which it's going to say view post. And on click, it's going to want to navigate. So I'm going to create a function handle click. And I'm going to need to use the Next.js router here. So I'm going to have to do import use router. And it's not from Next router. I've made this mistake in previous tutorials. It's from Next navigation. I'm going to say const router is equal to use router here, calling this. And then to access my specific post, I'm going to want to go to router.push. And then I'm going to want to push to a template string here in JavaScript. I'm going to do / posts / whatever my ID is. Okay. And then I'm going to need to pass in for my button, my on click is going to be my handle click. Okay. So I just made a new client component here because I'm performing client-side navigation. So it needs to be a client component. And I'm importing the router from Next.js. And when someone clicks on my button, it is going to navigate to / post / whatever the ID of my post button is. So now within my post component, instead of making this entire component a server component, we're just going to import my post nav button. And then I'm just going to give it an ID of my post ID. Okay. And then let's also add just a few styles here to make these stand out. So I'm going to do border 1 pixel solid white because my background is black. And I don't generally recommend doing your styles this way in line like this, but for the sake of this tutorial, this will be enough to make this look better than terrible. So we'll go with this. So just some padding, just some margin, and that should be okay for now. So I have my post here. I have my post nav button. And then for my page here, this is where I need to get my data for my different posts here. So now it's time to create our API route handler. So you don't need to do this, but just for the sake of organization, I'm going to create a new API folder. And within this folder, I'm going to create another new folder, and I'm just going to call this posts. So I'm going to match API / post is going to handle where my posts function is or my post route is within my overall app. So I'm going to create a new file within post, and this is just going to be route.js. And let's go back to the docs here. And this is just going to be a static route handler. So I'm going to copy this right here from the docs, and we are going to paste this in here. So what I've just done is created a GET request handler for my API / post endpoint, in which what we're going to do is instead of using their example like database here, all we need to do is from our JSON placeholder API, I need to get this URL here. So placeholder.typecode.com / posts. And it's not going to be /1, it's just going to be / post to get all the posts. So I'm going to just copy that. And I'm going to set that as my new endpoint here. And I don't need my headers here. The API does not require that. So this will get all of my posts. And then I will convert it from JSON, and then I will return a next response, and I will be able to access that as my data here. Okay, so this should just create a new endpoint at right now, my website URL is just going to be http://localhost 3000. And it's going to be /posts. So I'm going to actually go ahead and copy this here, because I should have just made a new endpoint here to handle a GET request to this endpoint. And now if I go to my posts component here, what I should be able to do is I can just do async function get posts. That is going to equal, so const res is going to equal await. And then I'm going to make a fetch request to my endpoint that I just created. So this is going to be http://localhost:3000/posts. But it's not going to just be posts. It's going to be API/posts. Because in my app directory, this is going to be my root URL, so localhost 3000, and then /API/posts. And it's going to access this route handler here. Okay. So this should make a request here. And I should be able to say const data is equal to await res.json. And then I should say that I can return my data. And it's actually going to be data.data, because I'm in my route handler, I'm setting my data to be an object on the property called data. I wouldn't need to do this, but we're just going to leave it. So I'm going to return my data.data. And then here, I'm going to have to export default async function here. I'm going to say const post is going to equal my get posts function. I need to await this as well. And then all we're going to do right now is console.log my posts. And you could also, within this process, you could like use the generate static params function, which I cover in my dynamic routes video. We're not going to do this for the sake of route handling here, but just know that you could do that for our dynamic routes here as well. So if I go back to my post page and I refresh my page here, and then I check my node console, I should see my posts, which, as you can see, I do see a bunch of posts here. So I see posts is an array of all of my posts. Now, I don't really need all of these posts. So I'm going to go back into my route here, and I'm going to now say const post is going to equal data.slice. And I'm just going to do the first 5 here. And then I'm going to say my data is my posts. Okay. So now if I go back and I refresh and then I open my console here, my first 1, 2, 3, 4 posts. So this is exclusive. So it's just 0, 1, 2, and 3. So I think 4 posts is also fine. So this will give me my first post here. So now all we need to do within my post page here, and there's something I'm going to tell you in just a second here, so bear with me, and it's just one caveat to this. So I'm going to do h1 posts, and I'm going to render this within a React fragment, and we're going to move this h1 up a bit here. And then all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say post.map. And I'm going to map over a post, and I'm going to return a post for each one here. And I'm going to set my key is going to be equal to my post.id. My ID is going to also equal my post.id. And then my title is going to equal my post.title. And then my body is going to equal my post.body. And I could also just pass the entire post as a prop here. That might actually also make quite a bit of sense, but we're just going to go with this for now. I'm going to move this to separate lines. I don't have Prettier installed, but I would definitely recommend that in your applications as well. So now, if I didn't mess anything up, I should go back to my post page, and I do see all of my different posts here. So as you can see in this example, we created a new route handler that handles a GET request to /API/posts, and it makes a request to this API endpoint and returns the first 4 posts. And then we access our own endpoint here by doing this right here, just fetching our own API endpoint to localhost 3000 /API/posts. Now, you wouldn't really need to do this in this example here. We could just make our API request right here within our GET post function, and this could be to our JSON placeholder API. We wouldn't have needed to create a new route handler to get this data here. And that is actually going to be pretty common now with server components. I wouldn't need to really create a route handler for this because this already runs on the server and I could access this right away. So this wouldn't necessarily need to be done, but just to show you how route handlers work, I still think that this is helpful, but just wanted to give that caveat to where you don't always need to go create these route handlers just to request some data from a certain database or certain API, okay? But with that, that gives us all of our posts here. And if I did my client-side routing correctly, well, actually, I still need to create a post page. So within my post folder, not within my API, within just my post folder, I'm going to do a new folder, and it's going to be brackets ID to create a dynamic route segment here. And then I'm going to create a page.js file within this, and we're just going to export default function, and we're going to call this post page. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to need to create another, or we wouldn't necessarily need to do this, but we are going to create another route handler here to get the data for this post page. And I'm going to effectively going to say const post is equal get post. And I'm going to make this an async function here. And I'm going to await get post because I'm going to make this function here in a sec. I'm going to return on this page. I'm going to return just a single post in which we're going to have a same thing as earlier. ID is going to equal post.id. Title is going to equal post.title. Body is equal to post.body. I think that's all I need to have there. So I need to create a async function get post here. And what we're going to do here is we're going to make a request to a route that we create to get a post. Now, when I access this endpoint, I'm going to need to pass it a ID of the post that I want to get. I'm going to get my params here because since this is a dynamic route, I'm going to automatically be passed a object with a params property here that I can destructure. And then I'm going to pass in my params.id to my get post function. And then what I'm going to do here is similar to this page. I'm going to copy this, but I'm going to make a request to /API/posts, but then I'm going to do / whatever my ID is here. Okay. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And then in doing that, I'm going to say my result is awaiting that, and then return data.data. And then that should be all I need here for my get post function. But now I need to create my new route handler here for this dynamic segment. So within my API/post, I'm going to create a new folder, and similar to what I just did, square bracket ID square bracket. And within that, I'm going to create a route.js file. And I'm going to actually just copy the code from my other route.js file. I'm going to paste it in here. But the difference that we're going to have here is we are now going to want to access. We're going to have a request as our first argument. And then remember how I said, now that this is a dynamic segment, it's automatically going to be passed a second argument to this GET request that is going to be a context object that is going to give us a params property that is going to give us the params of our request here. Okay. So I'm going to say const post ID is now equal to params, and it's just going to be my dot ID, I believe. Let me go back to the Next.js docs here. Dynamic route segments. Yeah, it's just going to be params dot ID here. So I go back, and now I just need to do posts / whatever my post ID is. This is going to give us our ID. Then we're going to make a fetch request to our JSON API endpoint that is post / whatever our ID number is. Our data is just going to be our awaiting our res.json, and then we can just return our data right here. So I think that should probably work. I'm not incredibly confident because I just wrote a decent amount of code here, but when I click on a post, I should go to my post page, and it should, and I'm going to console log my post here just to see if we're getting the correct post. But I think that this should indeed work. So if I go back and I go view post, I get ID is not defined because I, in fact, did not accept my ID from there. So now, as you can see, when I come to this page, I do see my singular post here. So that is how you can create a dynamic route segment here for your post. So here it's post number 2. So you should see the title and the body change a little bit here, which you do in fact see. So hey, we got that working. We did have an error, but it wasn't too big. So now I think one final thing to do here maybe is let's also maybe make a post request handler. And then after that, you should have a pretty good understanding of how request handlers work here. So let's go ahead and let's go to the Next.js docs here. I'm going to copy their post request handler function here. So I'm going to do this here. And then I think I actually want to do this within my dynamic route here. So I'm going to make a post request to post / whatever my post ID is. I think that makes sense. So I'm going to export async function post, and I'm going to make this post request here. I don't need to do this. And let me go to the JSON docs here to see where it has creating a resource. So all I need to do is I'm going to copy this here to where it says method post. Body is what that body is, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And I think I should, and let me also get the correct URL here. And I actually, so this is just going to be to create a new post here. So what I'm actually going to do here, just to show you an example of how this works, is I'm going to actually move this code around a little bit. So instead of having this in our dynamic route, let's go ahead and just put this in our / post route here. So I'm going to do this, and then we're just going to create some UI that will just create a new post here when we click on it. Okay. So I'm going to copy this URL here like I was going to do and then forgot to do. And we're going to go back to our route handler, and we are going to do that. And this should read this. And then all I'm going to do here is, how about within my homepage here, let's create within this homepage, let's create a button that just says generate post. And it's going to make a post request to our API endpoint, and we'll just console log the response and make sure that we have correctly made that post. Because since this JSON placeholder is just like an open API, we're not actually going to be making new posts in their database, but this is going to simulate how we could do that. So let's create a new component and just call this generate post component. And it's going to just be a button. So let's do generate posts button.jsx, and this is going to be a client component. I'm going to export default function generate post button. And what we're going to do is we're going to first have a function within this that is handle click. And this is going to make a fetch request to our endpoint to generate a post. Okay. So what I need to do here is something along these lines here. I'm going to just copy this here again. And I'm going to paste this in here. So I'm going to remove all this because we already handled that in our request handler. I'm going to move this as well. And I'm going to get rid of those emojis. Sometimes I accidentally hit that button there. And then we're going to format this a little bit better. And we are going to then convert the response from our own API to JSON. And then we're just going to console log that on this handle click function here. But this should not be our JSON placeholder endpoint. It should be to our posts endpoint here. So it should be to this localhost API post endpoint. So if I go back to generate post button, I can now copy this and paste it here. So this handle click function, it's going to make a fetch request that is going to be a post fetch request. So a post method to our API/post endpoint that we just created right here. So we created an endpoint here at API/post. And then within our route, we're handling a post request. And when we hit this endpoint with a post request, we're going to make a post to this endpoint here for this JSON placeholder that should create a new post for us. So all I need to do is I'm just going to return a button here that says generate post, and then our on click is going to be handle click. And then if I go to my page layout here, I'm just going to render this button here, right here. And when I click this button, I should see us a request or a response saying we've generated our posts. So if I now go back to localhost 3000, I see my generate post button that looks super, super ugly there. But let's open the console here. Let's click generate post. And you do indeed see I get a response here that is our newly created post. So that is how you can create a post request and a post request handler within your applications as well, because we hit our own API endpoint /post, and that accesses this endpoint here because we exported a function from API/post, and we created our own API handler there. So hopefully this video teaches everything you need to know about route handlers in Next.js. We covered GET request, dynamic kind of GET request handlers, and we covered posts. It would be very similar if you wanted to do put, patch, delete, all that stuff as well. So hopefully you learned a ton in this video, and stay tuned for more videos because we're going to cover some more Next.js to come. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.